Odin first looked at what the Bible tells us about the character of God to determine what kind of person God is. We needed to first understand what we meant when we say God. Who is this being that we're talking about? And now that we've done that, it's time to ask the question of whether or not such a person actually exists. Now, this question is in the field of study known as apologetics, which is an old Greek word for defense. But we have the unfortunate stereotype that apologetics is something highly intellectual and it's just something for smart nerds to discuss, but doesn't have much bearing on real life. And the reason I think is because there are only two options. Either you're arguing for God's existence to other believers, and so apologetics is superfluous, or you are arguing with staunch atheists whom you're never going to convince, and so apologetics is futile. Now, I think that's pretty faulty thinking on both accounts. There are some great defenders of the faith and apologetics organizations that see people cross that faith line on a daily basis. And plus, discussing apologetics with other believers is a way of sharpening one another to carry out 1 Peter 3:15, which tells us to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that is within you to anyone who asks. Sometimes those questions come in the form of questions about God's existence, and we ought to be ready. Now, this doesn't mean that you need an advanced degree in religion or philosophy. You don't need to have all of these arguments memorized, but we do have an obligation to be able to speak into the subject a little bit. So here we go. Odin describes 5 different types of arguments throughout classic Christianity to contend for the existence of God. My goal is to break down the complicated and to give it to you in bite-sized pieces that you can use. And so to that end, I'm going to do my best to describe all 5 of these, each one in 5 sentences or less. Now, obviously I'm going to leave things out doing that, but if you have further questions or want to discuss it further, leave a comment, send me an email. I'm happy to discuss that further with you. But number 1 is the teleological argument. Teleology is a word meaning end or purpose. Or fulfillment. So it's the argument from order and design. And so this is the idea that God's existence is plausible because we can clearly observe that there is order and design in the world. The likelihood of everything lining up the way it does is ridiculously small if there isn't some higher power behind it. Otherwise, everything would be chaos. But as it is, there is order and design, purpose throughout creation. And we know that things that don't have knowledge, that lack that knowledge and understanding, they only are directed by someone who does know and understands. And therefore, there must be an intelligent being directing all natural things. Number 2 is the anthropological argument. So the argument from humanity. And it's undeniable that intelligence exists. And so we have to account for that intelligence. It must have started somewhere, right? And so we're not talking about things, but consciousness or mind. That had to start somewhere. And similarly, the idea of personhood adds credibility since that we are personal. We have some compelling reasons to think that a higher being is also personal. Also, everywhere in the history of human consciousness, there is an idea of God, which suggests that our very nature points us to a creator. Number 3 is the cosmological argument. And this is the arguments for change or for movement, arguments on how the world works. So these arguments are based on observed knowledge of the world. 12th century theologian Thomas Aquinas did a masterful job at articulating this particular argument. At its core, it's the idea that as we observe motion, something had to cause that to move, right? Things don't just move on their own. Something had to cause it. And so we have to give an account for what moved creation, what moved the movable. And either, there are 2 options. Either there is an infinite regression of change, meaning A was moved by B, B was moved by C, C was moved by D, and so on in an infinite loop, which Odin calls that an intellectual embarrassment. Or there was an uncaused cause, someone who initiated all other changes, and Aquinas calls this the unmoved mover, or God. Number 4 is the pragmatic argument. Just as the world is being in order suggests an intelligent orderer as its cause, so does moral awareness in human decision making. It suggests there is a source of moral authority. All of humanity shares an inherent awareness of good and evil. Now, we may not always disagree on what actions belong in which category, but there is an inherent sense of good, of right and wrong within all of us. Philosopher William James, no real friend of Christianity, he articulated this argument pretty well. He concluded that the reality of God is practically validated by the fact that believing in God makes people function better, feel better, and they live more productive lives. Number 5 is the ontological argument. And this argument argues from the idea of a perfect being, and it's a little more difficult to follow, but it's really, really powerful when understood properly. So here it is. The very idea of God is proof of God's existence. And so that argument flows like this. We can conceive of an absolutely perfect being. And since existence is a necessary characteristic of that idea, an absolutely perfect being must exist if he is to be absolutely perfect. So which is greater? A perfect being that exists only in our minds, or a perfect being that exists in reality? Well, obviously a real one. And since God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, he must actually exist in reality, not just in our minds. Thanks for watching. I would love your help building up the TCB community, so please share my videos like this one on your social media platforms, and be sure to sign up for our email list for more great content.